For as long as I can remember, I've always loved the endless and unfathomable vacuum that we call space. Something always intrigued me about the unknown void that lay beyond our world. So I spent a decade and a half of my life to get there, and when I finally did, all my intrigue turned into fear as I experienced something so strange and disturbing. Something I still can't explain to this very day. Due to security reasons, I wouldn't be able to give out my real name, so I'll identify as Lin in this story. I was born in 1974 in Beijing, China, and ever since I was a kid, all I really wanted to do was to become a taikonaut. For those who don't know, the word taikonaut is the name used for Chinese astronauts. It comes from the Chinese word taikong, which means space or cosmos. I worked very hard towards this goal during my schooling years. I eventually got admitted into the Shanghai University, and I got my master's in aeronautics. It was from here that I started the process of becoming a taikonaut. It wasn't easy, as the requirements and screenings to become a taikonaut by the CNSA, China National Space Administration, were very rigorous and intense. For starters, all potential astronauts had to be between 1.6 and 1.73 meters and weigh between 55 kilograms and 70 kilograms. The small size and weight requirements were to make sure that we could fit properly into the cabin of the spacecraft, all while consuming less fuel. I also went through a lot of psychological tests. These tests were a key part of the space training, as all the space travel candidates were told that space traveling is a very isolated and uncertain journey. I knew the stress of being out in a vacuum that's very far from our planet could break even the strongest minds, but at that time, my love for space travel far outweighed the fear, and I was able to pass these tests. After the psychological tests, I and the other candidates were put into a hyperbaric chamber that kept us in an upside-down position for 5 days. We were told to drink, eat, and take pictures in this position. All these things were done to make sure that we could function in space. When we were done with the hyperbaric chamber, they gave us special suits that weighed about 120 kilograms before putting us in a water tank. This test emulated a weightless environment in addition to creating a makeshift environment that showed us what life outside the shuttle felt like. With the weightless test out of the way, we were taught survival skills in case our shuttle was thrown off course during re-entry and they couldn't find us for days. These skills ranged from fishing and hunting to the ability to recognize edible plants and fend ourselves from beasts and pests, all while knowing how to build a makeshift shelter. Lastly, our backgrounds and the history of our families were also rigorously checked to make sure that there weren't any anomalies, as that would lead to immediate disqualification. To be honest, undergoing all those tests had to be one of the hardest things I'd ever done in my life. But I was determined, and after a couple of years, I was among the lucky few to be chosen for the Shenzhou 7 spaceflight mission of the 25th of September 2008. I was 34 at the time, and I can never forget my excitement that morning as I arrived at the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center. The mission was to be 3 days long, and we were scheduled to take off with a Long March 2F rocket at exactly 2110 hours Central Standard Time. After all the preparations were made, it was finally time for launch. I remember having this electrifying feeling in my belly as the rocket took off. The rocket's rising acceleration put us in a state of hypergravitation, a condition where the force of gravity exceeds that on the surface of the Earth. This causes our body to weigh 8 times more than it would on Earth, and the intense vibrations of the shuttle were so violent that it caused all the organs in our body to shake. I remember being told that we would go through these things before the launch, but experiencing them firsthand was very intense. I won't lie, I was a little bit scared during those few minutes, but when it was over, I saw the most beautiful view I had ever seen in my life. I was speechless for the first few minutes, and I remember tearing up a little. My childhood dream had come true, and I was finally in space, and it was amazing. The mission went perfectly well across the first 2 days. We carried out a successful 22-minute spacewalk as we retrieved some experiment samples before waving the Chinese flag in space. After that, we all went back into the spacecraft. Having carried out our operation successfully, we decided to eat something, but that's when we heard it. An eerie knocking sound started to fill the spacecraft. We were all dead silent now as the strange sound took us by shock. We knew full well that there is no medium for sound to travel in space, so hearing those noises was mind-boggling. The knocking sound came again, but this time, I could hear them too clearly. It was as if I could hear the knocking in my very soul, and that's when it happened. I had suddenly entered this trance-like state, and I was surrounded by beings that I couldn't explain. It's very hard to put into words, as these humanoids didn't have a definite form. Their heads were constantly changing shape, and I couldn't make out any eyes or facial features. I can remember them raising what I assumed to be their hands as they attempted to touch me. I wanted to scream and defend myself, but I couldn't. I then watched how they drew a line from the top of my neck to the base of my torso. As they drew this line, I could see my skin split apart, but for some reason, I didn't feel any pain and my blood wasn't spilling. When they were done, all my organs were exposed, and I watched how they started to touch and rummage around inside me. I could feel their long limbs wrap around my heart and stomach. The sensation was otherworldly, as I felt like my body was a toy they were inspecting. As morbid as it sounds, it reminded me of dissecting rats in biology, as it looked like they were cutting me open to understand how I worked. I don't really know how long this lasted, but things soon started to get very foggy. I was trying my best to keep my eyes open, but that's when I felt one of the humanoids touch the center of my head. I instantly felt a rippling sensation that passed through my entire body, and I woke up. I realized that I was now surrounded by the entire crew as I saw the worried looks on their faces. I asked them if I had passed out, but they said I had gone deathly still for 8 hours, all while my eyes were constantly wide open. It was hard to relay what I had just experienced to them, but I tried my best to. Everyone was quiet while I told them what happened to me, and when I was done, they told me that, while they all heard the knocking, no other person but me had the strange out-of-body experience. Being surrounded by astronauts who had studied both science and engineering, they all found a way to come up with a feasible explanation for it, as they told me I probably hallucinated everything. I too was also a staunch believer in science, but I knew deep down that it felt too real for me to have hallucinated it. The knocking sounds had stopped now, and after I put myself together, we managed to get back to our normal routine. The space operation lasted exactly 2 days, 20 hours, 27 minutes. We landed safely in Siziwang Banner, Central Inner Mongolia, on the 28th of September 2008 at 1737 hours Central Standard Time. After arriving back at the base, the samples we had acquired were taken and we were told to rest. I realized that I was having some difficulties standing and walking, but this was fairly normal for astronauts after experiencing Earth's gravity again. After settling down, we reported the strange knocking noises that we heard to our superiors, and their response baffled us all. It turned out that we weren't the only taikonauts to have heard these noises, as China's first man in space, Mr. Yang Lui, also heard these noises during China's space expedition in 2003. Mr. Yang Liwei also heard these noises during China's space expedition in 2003. They told us that Mr. Liwei had recalled some knocking on the body of the spaceship, and it sounded like knocking an iron bucket with a wooden hammer in his interview. In his own words, it neither came from outside nor inside the spaceship. A lot of theories were thrown around by a couple of scientists and engineers. The first theory was given by Professor Goh Sher-Heong, an expert in space engineering at the National University of Singapore, and he said, "The traveling of sound requires a medium, be it air particles, water molecules, or metal, solid atoms. If it is knocking, there could be something physically hitting the spacecraft, carrying the astronaut." His colleague, Wei Sing So, also had a theory, as he said, it could have been a result of expansion or contraction of the spaceship, especially since the temperature of the spaceship's exterior could change considerably within the orbit. These statements were never officially confirmed to be the cause, as they both stated that the suggestion and theories were all speculative. We were also told that the same knocking sound was heard by other taikonauts during a space mission in 2005. Due to the repeated unexplained occurrences of the strange knocking sounds, it was put down as a normal phenomenon. And while everyone had heard the knocking noises, I was still the only one who had gone through the morbid, out-of-body experience as a result of the knocking sound. Having already written it off as a hallucination, I decided not to tell my superiors at the CNSA, as I didn't want to raise alarm or ruin the mood of the successful mission. I believe my fellow taikonauts felt the same way, and a word wasn't said about it again. It's been about 15 years since the launch of the Shenzhou 7. I keep on telling myself that it was a hallucination caused by the minor fears or excitement I felt on the mission. I try not to think about it, but sometimes I can still feel their long hands rummaging around inside of me like I was their science project. I know many of you won't believe me, and I don't blame you. I'm still finding it hard to believe myself, but only time will tell if I hallucinated it all, or if they're still out there, waiting to split us all open and to play with our organs.
The silence was upsetting. I can't bear it anymore. Firstly, let me take you to the past. When we left our planet, the Earth, there had been 15 men on board. Then after an accident, there were only 2 left, me and Bobby. We were on a 2-year mission to explore space. Bobby was reading a novel. I was having coffee, and I asked him for some, but he didn't respond. Actually, whenever I tried to talk to him, he just ignored me. He wouldn't even look at me. Ever since the accident, he only spoke to me when necessary. Otherwise, he lived like a lonely person. One day I tried again and sat before him. You know I'm not guilty. It wasn't my fault. It was an accident. You know it, right? You have to believe me. Bobby, please. This time he was making coffee for himself and ignored me again. Bobby didn't even reply. It had been 6 months since the accident. One of the engines had burned out. It had to be repaired. 18 men went out on a spacewalk to fix it. Bobby and I had been left alone on the ship. Our job was to test if the system was working correctly. There was a checklist we had to go through. Bobby went through the list, calling out each one by one. I flipped the switches. Something went wrong. I don't know how it happened, but I flipped the wrong switch. The engines were not working properly and made loud noises. Some of the men on the spacewalk were incinerated immediately. At least, I hope that's what happened. The others were sent hurtling into space. Their bodies are still out there, somewhere, floating aimlessly. They died a pathetic death, and now their corpses are somewhere out there in the vastness of space. Bobby, I didn't mean to kill him. It was an accident. Bobby turned and glared at me. It was murder. If it hadn't been for you, those 18 men would still be alive. I am sure you would have killed me too if you'd had the chance. In another 6 months, we both will be back on Earth. Then you will stand trial for your crimes. I will sue you and I will make sure they know exactly what you did. They will find you guilty, and you will rot in prison. I sighed and looked at the clock. Calm down, okay? It's time for the spacewalk. Every day we had to do a spacewalk to check the integrity of the spaceship's outer hull and make sure there was no damage. It was my turn today. It was always my turn ever since the accident. Bobby didn't trust me one bit. I didn't trust him either. While I went out on the spacewalk, he stayed on the ship. If he wanted to, he could lock me out. I wasn't going to let that happen, so when he wasn't looking, I took the key to the hatch so I could open it from the outside if I needed to. I put on my spacesuit and my magnetic boots and stepped into the airlock. Sealing the door behind me, I climbed the ladder and opened the hatch. Then I stepped out onto the hull of the ship. I stared out at the vast blackness of space, dotted with twinkling stars. It was completely silent. I walked across the side of the ship, my magnetic boots clamping against the hull. After examining the outside, I clicked the button on my communication and shouted, "Bobby, one of the plates is badly damaged. It needs to be repaired immediately." He replied, "Okay, I'm coming." After a while, Bobby emerged from the hatch wearing his spacesuit. He was carrying a toolbox with him. He came walking towards me, his magnetic boots clamping slowly along the hull. "Where is it?" he asked. I didn't reply. I just pointed toward the rear of the spacecraft. Bobby started walking, looking for the damage. As soon as he turned his back to me, I slipped down the hatch and closed it behind me. I unlocked the door and stepped out of the airlock. Over the communicator, I could hear Bobby shouting and screaming. I took off my helmet so I didn't have to listen to him. I could hear his magnetic boots clomping back and forth across the hull of the ship. He was probably trying to pry upon the hatch, desperate to get back inside the ship before his oxygen ran out. But it was no use. Soon, he would be dead. Suddenly, Bobby appeared outside the port window. His face was contorted and his eyes were bulging out of their sockets. He was slowly suffocating. I watched as his face turned red, then blue. He clawed at his helmet as he struggled to draw his last breath. Blood began running from his eyes. I couldn't stand to watch anymore. It made me sick. Without Bobby, there was nobody to tell the people back on Earth about the accident. I could make up some story to explain the disappearance of the rest of the crew, and nobody would suspect. Days passed as the ship continued on its slow progress back to Earth. Whenever I looked out the port window, Bobby would be standing there, swaying back and forth, staring at me. His magnetic boots kept him fixed. His dead eyes hung out of their sockets. I tried not to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Eventually, I couldn't stand the sight of him any longer. I put on my spacesuit and my magnetic boots and made my way to the airlock. I made sure to bring the key with me. I didn't want to get stranded on the outside. I opened the hatch and stepped out onto the hull of the ship. The hatch door closed behind me. I clomped across the ship toward Bobby's corpse. I couldn't bear to look him in the face. I tugged at his magnetic boots, struggling to free him from the ship's hull. I gave him a hard shove, and his weightless body began to drift away. "Goodbye, Bobby." "Goodbye." I turned and started clomping back towards the hatch. I looked back at Bobby's corpse as it drifted off into the vastness of space. His bulging, lifeless eyes stared back at me. His twisted mouth seemed to grin at me. One of his arms moved slightly as if he was waving at me. Then, as he slowly floated away, I caught sight of something in his gloved hand. "No shit! Please, no!" I cried. His hand was clutching the key to the door. The silence of space is all around me. For almost an hour, I've been standing here, fixed to the hull of the ship, swaying back and forth, listening to the silence. I'm waiting for the moment when my oxygen supply runs out. Waiting until my face turns red and then blue. Waiting until I start clawing at my helmet as I struggle for my last breath. Waiting for the blood to start running from my eyes. And then I will know it's finally over.